historical relationships with the land continue to this day. We also acknowledge the elders past and present, including MSU's current Council of Elders, and humbly ask for their guidance. The Valley of the Flowers has been and remains a place of learning for Native American peoples who for millennia have passed ways of knowing, being, and doing from one generation to the next. While land acknowledgement is not enough, it is an important social justice and decolonial practice that promotes indigenous visibility and a reminder that we are on settled indigenous land. And now, Dr. Steve and Sofie.
All right. Thanks, everyone. It's good to see everyone. I apologize for that little issue we had last week. That was a bummer. I'm glad I still got a chance to come talk to everyone. And so I'm going to talk to you about this journey that I've taken. I started doing this line of work when I was first a graduate student. And so it's kind of a neat thing because it transcends being a graduate student, being a NASA researcher, being a faculty professor. And then I'll give you a little bit about myself and my story, how I got here as well, because it's not just all about what I've done and stuff. I want to give you a little bit of about me a little bit, so when we get a chance to see again in the future here, we maybe have some talking points. So I grew up in Port Angeles, Washington, on the Olympic Peninsula, a little town right across from British Columbia, Vancouver. And so, Vancouver Island, I should say. And so I was a first generation college student. None of my family had graduated from college, so I was kind of the first one in that, and that had some challenges in its own. I wouldn't say that my family was not supportive of college in general, but all of my family was technical welders, loggers, and stuff of that sort. And so there was always that sentiment, oh man, that's a worthless college degree, why would you do that? And so I had to kind of go through that a little bit, going to the University of Washington. I enrolled there, but because my family didn't have the capability to support any help to college student, I had to work. I couldn't get any loans, and so I worked downtown Seattle at the Best Western Loyal Inn. If you know in the Seattle area, it's right next to the Elephant Car Wash, the big pink elephant in downtown Seattle. And so I had to work 40 hours a week to pay for school. And my second day on the job, I was the night auditor at the hotel, so I worked at night, slept little, went to classes in the day. My second day on the job, I had a stab victim, came in from the park across the street, blood everywhere. I had to shut things up and deal with that. A couple days later, we had an attempted robbery, and I was talking to the other guy, and he says, they didn't tell you. I'm like, they didn't tell me what? And the guy I replaced, he quit because they found him one morning hogtied in the bathroom and robbed. And so those are stories I didn't tell mom and dad for a little while later on. But, it kind of built. So when some of you are going through struggles, I understand that stuff. So if you ever want to talk about that, I will be glad to encourage you in those areas. Then I got a job as an engineer in South Seattle, Kent. And I was doing the stuff I was trained for. I'm like, this is awesome. I love this. But a year in, I'm like, I'm not just happy just doing the things that need to be done. I want to be calling the shots. And so then I decided to go back to graduate school and stayed at the University of Washington. It was familiar in materials engineer, so I started in ceramic engineering, which is a material science discipline. Went and got my master's. I initially only went for my master's at that point because at that time I already had 2 kids, and so I needed to make sure I had something to lean on if things went bad. And so I finished that. I'm like, wow, this is awesome. I'm going to keep going. And so I kept going for my doctoral degree, and then after that we'll talk about some of that progress there. And so I teach undergraduate classes, I teach upper level graduate classes, I teach the whole gamut. I enjoy the aspects of really digging into details. I enjoy the discovery and getting students that are not familiar with the field they're going into, getting them excited about that. And that's kind of fun to me. I love all the things that many of you like that brought you perhaps to the area. I love to travel and explore the globe, camping, hiking, backpacking, all that kind of stuff. And so before we get into stuff, I'm going to show you a little bit about me, the things that I've done, because some of you may not remember some of the details that I talk about as I go along. But if I show you some of the things I've done, maybe that'll strike a chord and that'll give us a chance to talk about things. And so that's always kind of fun before we go into it. So a couple slides of my experience. If you're a fellow skier, how many of you are excited for the ski season? Yes, I'm looking forward to it as well. well. Last year, my family and I got up to Revelstoke in Canada. That is an incredible mountain. So if you ever have a chance to get up there, oh, that was absolutely incredible. But beyond that, I love exploring the globe. You know, these days you hear nothing about, you know, discord across the world. And I find that the world is actually a lot more harmonious than sometimes we're led to believe. And I love that because I've had a chance to travel internationally a lot. My passion for that started in Thailand. We went trekking in Thailand. We built our own bamboo raft to go down the Meitang River. It started falling apart at the end. It was a little bit sketchy. My knot tying skills needed some work. Then after the rafts fell apart, we rode elephants down the river. So that was an incredible experience. I had a chance to explore China. My wife and I went there. We hired a driver, took us to a very remote part of the Great Wall, and we got a hike on the Great Wall of Nomen, about 7 miles on the Great Wall, and explore that. Then we went to Shanghai, 24 million people. I mean, it is like Disneyland. Being from Montana, it was sensory overload, but it was certainly a fun experience. I'm fascinated with volcanoes. My sister lives in Santiago, Chile. She teaches college calculus in Santiago, and so we visited her and we went down to Pucón, Chile, which is down south. It's almost, to my mind, like a Bozeman of South America, or maybe a Livingston, a little bit smaller. But they let us hike up Villarrica volcano. It's an active volcano. It erupted in 2015, and we got to hike up to the rim, and you can still see the lava bubbling in that. And that was fantastic. My family went up there. My youngest son was 12 years old at the time. That was the first time they let anyone under 18 go up. So they made the exception, and now they allow it. So hopefully that was a good experience. I love volcanoes for some reason. The volcano in Costa Rica was fun as well. Went to Indonesia. How many of you heard of luwak coffee? None of you? That's the coffee where, okay, some of you, that's the coffee where the cat-like creature, a civet, eats the beans, poops out the beans, they collect the beans, clean them, roast them. You know, honestly, I don't think the coffee's all that worth it, but they're cute little critters. And climbed a volcano in the rain. That was kind of fun. Got a chance to actually photograph a lionfish in the flesh. And so that was certainly fun there. Ended up last summer, my family got to go to Vietnam. We trekked around Vietnam for nearly a month, and that was incredible, except for the fact on the bottom right, that was Ninh Binh. It was 106 degrees with 100% humidity. Oh my goodness, I think we almost melted. But there's some neat things to do. Ha Long Bay is incredible, and some of the night markets there were fun. What you may not recognize with Vietnam that was incredible is the coffee is extraordinary. They have just some fantastic coffee. You just get coffee anywhere. These fantastic coffees that come out, they're like a quarter or something like that. And the most famous one is Vietnamese Egg Coffee. And it's this really thick concoction. You kind of have to eat it. So you gotta keep mixing it up and getting. It was delicious. It was sweet. It was interesting, and it was kind of a fun experience. The neat thing about it is, you know, again, it's dirt cheap, and it takes these people 10 minutes to make this, so it was kind of fun. So I've been all over. I've really enjoyed exploring Asia, and so anyway, that's a little bit about me. I love traveling the globe, meeting new people, talking with them, and just exchanging information. Oops, we'll go beyond that now. So let's get into what I want to talk about, this kind of journey. Now, there will be some technical details, but I'm going to kind of try and move over that quickly. Some of you might want to know that. Some of you are like, oh, I don't want to know. But I kind of want to share this journey that I started kind of telling a story of something that I did as a student that I thought would be nothing. And now this is what I do, you know. And so it really started here when I was a graduate student. Now, I just come in as a graduate student at the University of Washington. I was working on a project, and we were working on a project for Philips Ultrasound, the people who make ultrasound equipment. So if you ever had a kidney or a spleen or something looked at, that's the kind of material that we use. And I'll let you see a piece if you're interested. The heart of an ultrasonic transducer is a little ceramic wafer. And what it turns out is you can't just have a chunk of ceramic. You've actually got to dice it up and have it partly ceramic and partly polymer. because it needs to match the acoustic characteristics of tissue to work really well. If it was all ceramic, it just wouldn't work. And so what they do is they take this material, they press it, then they cut it up. Well, there's a real problem with how it's done in understanding the material. The material that's used in ultrasonic transducers is called PLZT. And again, I'll walk you through it. It's lead zirconium titanate, lead lanthanum zirconium titanate. And the key thing is that it contains lead. And so lead is problematic because they cut these tiny channels that are less than 100 microns. So it's a little less than the diameter of your hair. And they cut them with diamond saws, and it creates lead dust. And that's a problem that is difficult to overcome. All the people that worked at that Philips ultrasound had to have weekly blood tests to make sure that they weren't exposed to high excess levels of lead. And so my project, they asked me to do, they said, well, is there a way that we can actually straight up make this really fine structure without having to cut it? And so I did some brainstorming, and I said, well, gee, I could take a bunch of little particles in water, make a suspension or a slurry, and I could freeze it. And if I freeze that, I could make really fine shapes, and could I use that to actually make these? And you might say, that's absurd, but it actually worked. And so when we look at that, I came up with this idea that I'm going to freeze them. So I took these slurries, and I just put them in a mold that was about 1 inch diameter. The samples were less than 1 centimeter thick or 1/4 inch thick. And I would freeze these materials, and what's really nice about freezing is when you freeze a slurry, it's really strong. So you can really pry it out of the mold even though it was really fine dimensions, and I'm like, this is great. But I struggled, and at this point I almost gave up because every time I would try and freeze water, I would get this junk. I would get all these little water crystals that were freezing and growing and causing all sorts of problems. And I was like, geez, I don't know what to do with this. I can't get rid of these water crystals. Well, honestly, I don't know really where it came up with. I read something about the deep sea cod in the Atlantic Ocean that produces an antifreeze protein that allows it to survive with over 70% of its body mass frozen. And then it dethaws and it reanimates. And I'm like, wow, because the problem is that when ice crystals grow in tissue, they puncture tissue walls and then cells die, and that's why we can't do cryogenic freezing of our cells and wake up sometime after 2020. That would be wonderful, huh? And so we certainly have that problem. So I started looking at that. Well, these antifreeze proteins that the deep sea Atlantic cod make, they're cool, and I'm like, great, I want some of these synthesized. They're expensive. They're $10,000 a gram. And that pretty much exceeds a graduate student's budget enormously. So I started looking at stuff. I started reading all these blood and tissue freezing journals. And this was a departure for me. I do not like blood. I do not like that kind of stuff. But I started looking at this, and I found all these different chemicals that people were using to freeze tissue so that it doesn't get destroyed during the process. Dimethyl sulfoxide, DMSO, is used a lot in hospital-type systems, but sulfur is contaminating. And so I found one article where people actually use glycerol, which is a simple sugar. And I thought, it can't be that easy. So I put some glycerol in my slurry, and voila, boom, all those frozen structures were gone. And I'm like, ka-ching, this was great. Now I could make structures that were dense, and I could cast them to really fine shapes. And I'm like, this is just the ticket. And so then I went one step further, and sure enough, I could actually make transducers out of this material without having to dice them. And so we made these structures. I published a paper on this. And again, at the time, I thought this was nothing, but at this time, too, it's still my most referenced paper that I've ever done, approaching 300 references. People love this stuff. And again, it was something that I thought, geez, I just froze a slurry. How difficult can it be? And so at that point, that finished up my master's thesis. And at that point, I'm like, I want to keep going on for my doctoral work, but at the same point, to me at that time, freezing was kind of trivial. I made it work. What else was there to do? And I was fascinated with superconductors. I said, I want to get into ceramic superconductors, quantum levitation when you see the magnet levitated. I wanted to get into that, make them better. And so I got in that for 3 years. I worked on that. I worked with Boeing. We were making a flywheel energy storage system. So a superconducting bearing allowed a flywheel to spin up to 100,000 RPMs. This little system about that big could then store almost 30 kilowatts of electricity. And it was awesome. I'm like, this is great. So I went through that and I graduated. And then I started looking at different jobs. And sorry, masks are not made for people with beards. And so if you see me adjusting this thing, it's going to happen quite a bit. And so I was looking at different jobs. I was very much interested in a job at Sandia National Lab. I love the West Coast. I love the mountains. I love out here. But then NASA. I mean, NASA was a draw. Like NASA. But Cleveland, Ohio is if you're from Cleveland, I enjoyed living there. I didn't necessarily want to raise my family there, but I couldn't resist the pull to go to NASA. And so I picked up the family. I went to NASA. I was at the Glenn Research Center, and it's right outside of the Cleveland Hopkins Airport. So if you ever fly into Cleveland, you are literally right there, and you'll probably see the NASA Research Center. And NASA was an awesome place to work. It's part academic, and yet you've got resources to do everywhere. What I always tell students, particularly in engineering that do design, is you're always going to be butting up against things that cost too much. But at NASA, your goal is performance. And so when you say you need something to make it work, the answer is yes. And you're like, well, okay, so it's okay if this costs $10,000. Yes. I'm like, oh, great. And so I love that. That was fantastic. I love that the campus had just a plethora of facilities. I was in the Materials Research Center right in the middle, but we had some incredible facilities. We had a 10-foot by 10-foot supersonic wind tunnel, which is one of the largest in the United States, and so people all over the world would come and schedule time on this. Sometimes it wasn't top secret, other times it was, and then there was guards posted, you couldn't go in and stuff of that sort. We also had a smaller 5 by 7 wind tunnel, and what's incredible, if you think about it, right over here was the wind tunnel, a little 10-foot by 10-foot section here. All of this building supported that wind tunnel. And this entire building right here was filled with desiccant to dry the air. Ohio's a pretty moist place, and if you start compressing air a lot, you create a flood inside the chamber. And so more desiccant than you have ever seen here. You know that little stuff the dry rite stuff that you probably have seen in college chemistry or high school chemistry? I mean, just more of that than you can possibly imagine. And so that was the kind of stuff there. That was fun to work on. They had combustion research, another smaller wind tunnel, 5-second microgravity drop tower. I'll talk about that as well. It's basically a drop tower. It's at ground level. It goes 500 feet straight down. And they drop these giant trolleys into what are tons of beads of styrofoam. And it's really quite here. So I love the different facilities, and I'm the kind of person that I just didn't stay put. When I had time, I'd walk around and talk to people, find out ways to integrate. And so that was kind of fun for me. I really enjoyed that aspect. And so my goal at NASA was fuel cells, which are electrochemical conversion devices. And the idea behind a fuel cell is it takes chemical energy and converts it directly to electricity. No combustion, it's very efficient, and we wanted to apply it to unmanned aerial vehicles, maybe high-altitude UAVs. My particular mission was Mars and lunar power sources. And so we had to make these things that would survive a trip to Mars or a trip to the moon and still work and not leave astronauts stranded. And so that was kind of the nature of my project. Again, still a departure from the things I'd worked on before. And there's a fuel cell operation. Again, we're not going to get into the chemistry or things like that, but if we talk about a fuel cell that runs off hydrogen, and probably almost all of you know this, the beauty is hydrogen comes in, combines with water, or combines with oxygen, our only output is water. You know, it's incredibly clean. And so the bottom right is just a simple picture. Hydrogen in, oxygen in, and then the byproduct is water. But these membranes are special ceramic membranes that don't allow oxygen to get through, but oxygen ions. So oxygen grabs a couple of electrons and then it can hop through the lattice. It's actually the same material that makes a fuel cell work is what makes the oxygen sensor in your car work. And so, all of you probably have at least a semi-modern car, anywhere from 2, 4 to even 8 oxygen sensors. So you rely on the very same technology that a fuel cell is generated from. And so that was the goal, was to make these work in really extreme environments for NASA. And these were the size scales. So I donated my body to science when I still had hair, and I plucked a piece of hair and I looked at it under the SEM to really see how the size scale of my own hair compared to the systems I was trying to make. And the heart of a fuel cell is that electrolyte. That's that layer that allows oxygen to drop across it. and it's 1/8 the thickness of the hair. It's 10 microns. My hair is about 85 microns, probably less now, but we won't go there. And so you had this multi-layer device. And so I had to find a way to make these types of fuel cells that were being developed for the automotive industry work for NASA. And there was huge challenges to that. And so one of the biggest challenges is that there are 3 different materials and there are 3 different layers. And I love showing this picture because it really shows when you try and fire a ceramic material with different materials, it turns into a Pringle. And a fuel cell is much like a battery. One cell is about 1.2 volts, which is like a nickel metal hydride battery. You can't do much with that. So what do? You have to put them in electrical series. It's difficult to put a Pringle in electrical series. And so I looked at that and I said, wow, that design seems flawed for what we need at NASA. Because when you actually put it together, and again, there's a lot on the slide that you don't have to appreciate, the fuel cell is on the bottom, but you need this giant interconnect that can make cells in series. That interconnect's got to be able to flow fuel. And NASA very clearly did some modeling and said, we need cells that put out power with very little weight. And so they made this statement that says we need to be at or above 1 kilowatt per kilogram. And current state of the art was about a kilowatt per kilogram. So we weren't even close. And so we did some brainstorming, and a team member that I worked with, we came up with this idea. And I'll tell you, we actually were awarded a patent for this, and people are actually starting to license it, which is kind of cool. We came up with this Bioelectrode supported design. And we answered some questions and said, okay, let's use all the same materials so they don't warp like a Pringle, and then we'll infiltrate with solutions our active materials. We'll make a symmetric design so it's not misbalanced, and by doing that, we can actually maybe make the cathode and anode sufficiently porous so we don't need those big gas channels. That gas can flow right through the electrodes. And we're like, boom, we are onto something. But it turns out it's difficult to make pores in ceramic materials. So if you have a ceramic material and you make a powder, it's going to be dense. And so we use what are called thermal fugitives. And I just think it's a cool name that we use. And what it means is we just dump an organic in there. And then when we fire it up, what happens to the organic? The organic burns away. The ceramic is stable and it leaves a pore. And so graphite is very common. It gives kind of these flaky behavior. My favorite is cornstarch. Cornstarch works great, and if I have a favorite brand, it's the Argo brand that you could go buy at Safeway now. They're beautiful, about 10 micron little spheres of cornstarch. It's dirt cheap and it works well. You can also do glassy carbon spheres, but they're a fortune, and so it's difficult to justify those. But there's no way that we could make gas channels in those kind of pores. And then not only that, if you're making a fuel cell, you need large areas of ceramic that are very large but very, very thin. And so that technique existed, and I got this from Encyclopedia Britannica. It's a process called tape casting. You basically take a slurry, you meter it over on a mylar film, it creates a ceramic tape, and it's flexible because you put binders in it, then you can cut it to shape, and then you fire it, and then it makes your fuel cell component. So we had that going for us, but we didn't have a way to make pores. And so I had this epiphany. I remember I was in my office and I'm thinking, you know what? I remember back when I was doing my master's work, these stupid pores that I could not get rid of in my ultrasonic transducers, maybe those would be beneficial in this. So I came up with this crazy idea to merge my freeze processing with tape casting. And so at NASA, I had access to a machine shop, and so at night when the machinist left, I would go down and I was making my own fixture. And I'm not as good as they are at a machine shop, but I remember I was working one point and the director for the entire lab came by. And because he just likes to walk around at night, it's about 7 o'clock at night, and he opened up the door and said, "What are you doing here?" I'm like, oh gosh, I don't know if I was supposed to be there or not. I was getting reamed by the director of the campus. And then he said, "Oh, Steve, it's you." He says, "You machine too?" He said, "That's cool." And he left. And I'm like, whew, bullet dodged on that one. But I put this thing together, and I was able to actually make these tapes, and I froze these tapes. And it did. It made really cool pores. And so I made this little cartoon to make it a little bit easier, because what I would do is I would take this tape, and I'd pull it across the bed, but I replaced the regular bed with a refrigerated bed. And so I didn't have a refrigerator system, and I love playing with liquid nitrogen, so I cooled the beds with liquid nitrogen. And then I'd put them on a table and I'd freeze them. And as these little tapes would roll by, these little ice crystals grow. And as the ice crystals grow, they make these pores. So we call it ice templating because ice becomes our pores. And actually, it's beneficial. And if you look at this, what's really cool, if you remember, in some cases, when you freeze water, it rejects solutes. So if there's salt in the water or there's ions, it rejects that. But in my case, it actually rejected the ceramic particles. So all the ice crystals were just pure ice. And so what can you do with ice once it's there? Is you can put it under vacuum and sublime it, and it leaves a beautiful pore. And so I found that that worked, and I actually made structures. Those are my structures. I made pore structures that had never been seen before through this process, and people got really excited about that and were like, okay, we can do it. So I went on a mission. I started studying it. If I changed the solids of the slurry, I could make more pores or less pores by doing that. If I changed the temperature of the slurry, if it was really low temperature, the pores were really straight. If it was a warmer temperature, there were dendritic pores. And so I realized, oh, this is going to work really, really nicely. And so we started making tapes. These are actual tapes that were cast, and that's what it looks like when I freeze cast my tapes. It doesn't look really exotic, but the tape is frozen, I freeze dry it, and it's flexible, so I cut it to shape so I can make these shapes to make fuel cells and do all that kind of stuff. And then I put that together, and voila, it worked. I made a fuel cell that worked for NASA. I infiltrated with electrodes. The electrodes were porous enough that gas delivery could occur. And so we were able to make a cell that actually supported the mission's goal. We got 2 patents for that. We got a company that is licensing that technology now. And it's created a lot of neat things that we can do. And so again, this freezing process that I thought, oh, this is nothing. I mean, I'm just doing this because I'm a graduate student. I have to do this. All of a sudden, this is a technology that NASA sees as a way to get people to Mars, and power systems that were also now robust and strong enough to get there. And it was made possible by freezing ceramic slurries. And so people started seeing this, and they said, hey, you know what? Those little pores that you can generate are really kind of cool, and they might be neat in other applications as well. And so one of the things I found interesting is it was easy to make really big cells. At the current state-of-the-art time, most people were making cells that were about 1 inch in diameter. And so I made a bet with the guy in the lab. I said, I bet you I can make one that's 7 inches in diameter. And my first cell worked, and so then I painted the NASA meatball on it, and that's still at the Gwen Research Center. But nonetheless, it showed we could scale this, we could make these very nicely, and it was mission success. And so one of the side things that it is, as I developed that, I was always fascinated with the drop tower. So there is the 5-second drop tower, and those are these big equipment systems that they make that drop into the drop tower. And you know, I don't like heights all that much. And so when you go over and you look down, I mean, even though there's a rail, it just makes my heart flutter a little bit. It is a long way down. You know, maybe jumping into the styrofoam bin would be okay because it is a massive styrofoam bin, about 30 feet deep, 30 feet wide. And so this thing hits. And so I got to talking to people in there, and again, a group of people were saying, I was asking them a project they were doing, and they were in a project, they were trying to grow plants in space. And so, just my inquisitive nature, I said, well, what's the problem with that? Why can't we grow a plant in space? Well, it turns out that in space, plants will only grow really well if you bubble oxygen gas to their roots. If you bubble oxygen gas to the roots, they'll grow. But in space, there's no buoyancy. So if you have gas in a liquid, it's dual phase flow. I'm not a dual phase flow expert, but there are people that just study this at this university. And it's difficult because the air bubbles will become trapped. Eventually, they'll form pockets and cavities, and you can't pump. And so I came up with this idea, and I said, wait a minute. I've got these cool membranes, and I could actually make them pumpless. I could actually drive oxygen to the roots with these little braided pore membranes that I made. And it actually worked. Because the membrane is a capillary, but it looks like that, the capillary pressure is lower at the bottom, higher at the top, so it sucks water in the absence of gravity. And so it sucks water and brought bubbles to the roots. And we got to do some drop tower tests, and this was great. And I was excited because I was thinking, oh man, we're gonna be able astronauts to get to Mars. And I gave a short talk, and I mentioned, yeah, the ability to have a sustainable food supply is going to be fantastic. And one of the lead members of the project said, Steve, I got to talk to you. I'm like, oh, what did I say? He said, no, we actually are not interested in the plans for food. He said it's actually cheaper and more economical and easier just to do dehydrated food and then recycle water. He said it's a long trip and the astronauts needed something to do. So now I'm working on a hobby. That's not so much fun. But nonetheless, I mean, the minimum trip to Mars is 9 months. It gets a lot longer depending on where the orbit is. But I'm like, all right, hey, great. I mean, if we can solve problems, we can do it. I never got to do anything more on that because then I came to Montana State University after that. And but it was always kind of fun saying, what could we do? Where could we go with these sorts of things? And it's just kind of being receptive and talking to people and realizing, hey, I can do something with that. I can work with you on that. And so I found a lot of times too that serendipitous discovery is really fantastic. And so a lot of you, as you go through classes, you're going to be in labs or you're going to do something like that. And you always want things to work out perfectly, right? You always want to know that you make a measurement, works perfectly, you can write it up. But when it doesn't work, it is a pain. But I have actually learned more from those things that didn't work than the things that worked perfectly. So when you see that stuff, don't just be bummed and say, it didn't work. Learn from it, because almost all of the great things that I do and all of the research that I do now typically comes from those serendipitous discoveries that I at least thought it was cool enough to look at. All right, within that, then I came to Montana State University. I didn't do freeze casting for a while because that was a NASA patented technology. It was being licensed, so it would have been a little funny to keep working on that. And so I continued working on fuel cells for the Department of Energy, but they had a different design in mind, tubular design. So I certainly started working in that. And then more recently, only in the past 3 years, I was talking to some researchers at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And they were talking about a transition from lithium batteries to what they call a solid-state lithium battery. And at first, I didn't know what quite that meant until I looked at a slide and looked at the materials. They're making lithium batteries out of ceramics. I'm like, cool, sweet. That is my bread and butter. I am in business. So I said, tell me about this. So a typical lithium-ion battery has an electrolyte layer, which is a liquid layer. It's an ethylene carbonate, and it's problematic because it's flammable and it's toxic. And so one of the problems with safe lithium-ion batteries is the flammability of the materials used in this. And so does it seem like we could make it safer if we removed a flammable liquid with a ceramic? Bingo, right? That's great. Not too many ceramics catch fire and burn. And so we have an anode, a cathode, an electrolyte, so concepts of fuel cells, and we have these polymeric and liquid components. And so we're actually starting to replace them with ceramic components. And so I was shown a slide, and they said, this is what we're thinking of as, okay, there's actually a wrapped battery, and all those red spots under a thermal image are hot spots. And eventually, if those spots get too hot, they can catch fire or they can short the battery. But a ceramic has heat tolerance. It doesn't really hurt it to get a little bit hot. So we could have something inherently safer. And you might see that and say, well, could you ever wrap a ceramic? Well, when ceramics get really, really thin, they get quite flexible. So those 10 micron membranes I showed you before, I could take that membrane and bend it over into a U and it wouldn't break. They get really flexible. So we may have had some here. So I was shown this picture and they said, oh, Steve, this is what we have in mind for a state-of-the-art ceramic battery. Do those little pores look familiar? Those are the kind of pores that tell you that's the standard way of making pores. A lot of people don't know anyone different. And they said, so we can make this all ceramic cell with lithium metal as an anode. And we can make really high energy cells, but when we try and make the cells bigger for more energy density, and we all like that, right? We'd all like a greater capacity of our batteries, right? That's a huge driving factor in battery development is capacity. So the question is, can we make batteries with more capacity? The problem was with these ceramic systems is lithium ions to make the battery work have to travel around all those nooks and crannies in the ceramic material. And so as you make this electrode bigger and bigger, it has more capacity, but it'll only work at a slower rate because it takes a lot of time for the lithium to move. And so I said, I have got an idea for you guys. And so I said, what if we were to replace that porous ceramic with this freeze-based ceramic? They're pillars instead of a tortuous path. And so you basically have these little, what we call lithium diffusion highways. And so lithium can go up here, and we're like, we can make this work. So we applied for a grant with the Department of Energy. We were awarded the grant, and next thing you know, we came up with this idea that kind of reminded us of the terracotta army in Xi'an, China. I didn't get a chance to go see that, by the way, when I was in China. I wanted to, but nonetheless. So we have these little pillars. All the little terracotta armies are the battery components. We put those in there. We have this pillar of support, and we can make batteries like this that were all solid state. So you could puncture them, you could overheat them, and they won't get damaged. And so we started making them, and so these are some of the first lithium-ion batteries that we've made at MSU. So it's a new direction in lithium-ion batteries. We've already published a number of papers. There's a number of patents out. People are excited about this. And I'm working on a new project with the Army for developing higher capacity batteries based on this. And so, wow, has this had legs? And so I kind of like to think about this from the big picture. You know, what was this path like? And this is the path. In 1997, I started working with water and freezing these things. And I worked a little bit, then I made these ultrasonic transducers, then I dropped it for a while. Then I picked it up, NASA became interested. I worked with it again, I'm like, this is great. But then I stopped it and I let it go for a while. And then again, it gets picked up into this battery work, and next thing you know, we've got 5+ patents on it, multiple publications. We're building batteries, fuel cells, photovoltaics, and now hypersonic leading-edge composites with these materials. And so it's just extraordinary where it came. Something that, again, I thought was quite simple. And if someone would ask me, is this anything really good? I would have probably said, I don't know. I just used it to solve a problem. And it turns out when you look in the right areas, there's lots of problems that you can solve. And so that's kind of the story. I guess I talked a little bit quicker, making sure that I didn't go over and give people time to ask questions. So that's what I've got for you. Anyone have any questions? Not everyone will. Yeah.
So will these developments help lead to like denser batteries too?
Absolutely. Two things that we're looking at now is higher energy density, so the same size package but much more energy. The other thing that we're looking at is very, very fast charge-discharge rates. So there's always this thing where people say more and more capacity, and you think, well, in a car you want more and more capacity. But would you be worried about capacity in your car if you could fill up your battery in 3 minutes? Not as much. And so there's this competing goals of saying how high a capacity, or if I lower the capacity, is it okay if I can just charge it just like that? And so these ceramics, because they don't overheat, allow insanely high charging rates without damaging the systems. And so that's actually what we're looking at now, is actually getting charging rates that are off the charts compared to what you have in your phones and your laptops. Literally minutes to get the kinds of full charges that we need, as opposed to hours or overnight. Great question. Yeah?
And so these are batteries that will be potentially usable for like space travel, but then also like as far as like a price point, are those things that would fit in cars?
Absolutely.
Or like as house batteries?
The one challenge that the battery people haven't fully consolidated, because the batteries have been worked on for a year, our contribution with ceramics is much less, is a lot of the battery people that have worked with polymers their whole life forget that when you make a ceramic, you also have to fire it, or what we call sinter it. And it's not too bad. These materials are only 1100 degrees, and you might say that sounds hot. But believe me, in my experience, that's actually really low. That's easily done. But these people don't get it. They're like, what do you mean you have to heat it? I'm like, particles just don't do anything. They've got to be kind of joined together. And so we really sometimes struggle with people that are so used to making polymers, and all of a sudden we bring in, and then the first thing they think is, oh, they think of glass. Well, is this thing gonna break? And it's like, you're thinking of glass. These are engineered ceramics and very thin membranes, and all of a sudden you show them a membrane that you can bend, and you're like, wow, I didn't know it could do that. So, you know, as we're breaking into batteries, I mean, I think of battery community as this big thing. You know, a little tiny point is those of us working on these ceramic batteries. But there's really no other way to make a battery safe without getting rid of the flammable electrolytes. And I mean, that's the bane of what we have. We'd like to take extra batteries. I mean, the TSA even on flights limits how many extra batteries you can take because they can be a hazard. We've seen enough, whether it's hoverboards, Note 7s, or whatever, lithium batteries, if they short and fail, they can explode. And so we need to move to a system where that's not even possible. And we've taken some of our systems and driven a nail through them, and they still work, obviously at reduced capacity, but they still work. Nothing is catching on fire or anything like that, but we have some work to go on that. But that's the exciting paradigm, is that it actually applies, because the safety that we can bring towards consumer electronics would be immense. Yeah.
When do you expect like ceramics and batteries to become like the new standard for you?
You know, I think so. I may be a little bit biased, but there's a couple barriers that we have to get through. First of all, people that aren't familiar with ceramics and think, how are we ever going to get that to work? The other barrier, one that I'm just starting to learn about, is that these large companies that make batteries, whether for Teslas or for iPhones or whatever, they have billions of dollars invested in factories that make that specific kind of battery. And so I could potentially propose making another battery, but they wouldn't necessarily be able to use what they've already got invested in. So there's this lag of companies that are saying that could be cool. Because first of all, my system is water-based, right? A lot of traditional batteries use a solvent called NMP. It's toxic, it's flammable, no one wants to use it. But when I say, hey, use water, I'm like, no way am I bringing water into this plant. You know, so there's this huge lag in saying manufacturing, we have to show that you can have this transformative jump before there's going to be people that say, okay, we're going to build a separate factory that can make these. And so it's going to be a slow start. It's going to take a little while to overcome all the equipment that's used for the past decades to make lithium polymer batteries. That's a great question, though. One that I can't directly control, but we can start that. Yeah?
What's the cost to make one of them? Like, just like a regular?
It's tough to come into that. The battery, the material that we use, it's a garnet structured material. So if you think of the gemstone of a garnet, it's got that same structure, but it's not transparent. It uses lithium, lanthanum, and zirconia. None of them are particularly expensive materials, but when materials are new and few people are making them, they can be a little bit more expensive. But we can actually make the material in my own lab. My students have made it. And so, honestly, I think because you can limit the toxicity of polymer components, you know, we can potentially make it less, but that sintering is a problem. And so I wasn't intending to talk about it, but it's a great opportunity. So I presented this with my students, and we started talking about, can we do something better than heating these in a furnace? And so my student, and maybe, you know, the apple hasn't fallen far, and that's fantastic. He had this crazy idea that he was going to go buy a microwave at Goodwill, and he was going to try and heat these in the microwave. And microwave sintering has been around, and I thought, that's ridiculous. It worked incredibly well. And so we've got this Samsung microwave in the Fuma hood, and what's really incredible is if I sinter this thing, I've got a sinter at a slow ramp right in the furnace. It's a 12-hour process. We put it in the evening, we go, and Stephen pulls these things out in 5 minutes in the microwave that look nearly as good. Now, it's not as uniform. There's some things to be worked out, but something like that could really make the edge. And we've got some work to go, but it's always kind of fun when I get people that come into the lab, safety inspections, because it's not a food-based lab, but they see microwaves. I'm like, no, we are not cooking in what you think we're cooking. Yeah.
How are they weight to power wise versus
Wait, so it turns out that some of these ceramic materials conduct lithium ions better than some of the electrolyte materials. Now the polymers have a density of about 1 gram per cc, and the ceramic membranes have a density of about 7 grams per cc. So there is a weight disparity, but part of the problem is that if you think of a polymer electrolyte, the problem why batteries fail is over time, lithium metal dendrites can grow through the electrolyte. And then they short the cell, they overheat, and they cause problems. The lithium metal dendrites have a lot more difficulty growing through a ceramic, so we can make the ceramic thinner. And we don't have the problems that we have with the metal. But there's certainly a little bit of a challenge on that front as well. But if we make these things as thin as possible, I don't think the weight penalty is going to be as bad as it seems. But if we start talking about, mobile stuff, boy, someone really wants that. If we talk about mobile applications, certainly that density could become an issue, and those are some challenges we still need to work out. Great? Yeah?
How big have you got the batteries?
So we made little 2-inch by 3-inch pouch cells, which is similar to the size that you might see in your phone or something of that sort. And scale up is really not too much of a problem. The issue that we have is to get the highest density, we're using lithium metal as an anode, which is a really high energy density. But lithium metal is also quite sensitive to moisture, and it can catch fire and burn. So we have a glove box that we do assembly of cells in, and my glove box is only so big. So there's no reason these could be scaled up to enormous size scales. It's just the equipment I have at a university is not prepared for that. But scalability is something I enjoy exploring, and we have the means to do that. Great questions, yeah.
Actually, one up there.
Are you doing the kind of same process for photovoltaics, or what are you kind of doing?
Photovoltaics, it's a little bit interesting. I don't work on photovoltaics in the traditional sense. Okay, I gotta turn this thing off, I apologize. I work on a system called thermal photovoltaics. And so this differs a little bit in that in my thermal photovoltaics, I'm interested in actually making the sun source. And so in a thermal photovoltaic, I take a small emitter, and that emitter is a ceramic, and when I heat it with a butane flame, it emits a lot of light. And so in a small little unit about this size, I can surround that light source with photovoltaic panels, and all you need is butane or propane, and you have a super portable power source. And so one of the problems is that when you heat a lot of emitters that are used, they're called black body emitters because they emit like the sun over the entire electromagnetic spectrum. But photovoltaic panels only absorb a fraction of that. And so if it can't absorb all of that, you end up having to have all these filters to deal with that excess light, and it generates a lot of heat. And so we're making these materials not with traditional emitters. We use a ceramic, it's a rare earth oxide called europium oxide. And it sounds kind of cool, right? It's a material that's on the lanthanide series. It's not horribly expensive, but if you try and take this material and heat it up with a butane flame very quickly, boom, it'll blow up because it just can't support thermal shock. Well, it turns out that these freeze-cast ceramics are incredibly resilient to thermal shock. So I brought an undergraduate student in, and she actually made little thimbles of europium oxide, and she freeze-cast them. And they have all these porous structures. We turn it upside down, we hit it with a butane flame, it doesn't break. And the europium oxide actually emits almost perfectly for a silicon panel. And so we actually, we've just started this again because we didn't know we could use europium oxide. I'm working on some new proposals on it. So it's kind of a photovoltaic, but it's a really niche. Great question, though. Question? Oh, sorry, you're right in front of me.
So what stuff are you doing with hypersonic leading edge composites?
So I'm working with an aerospace company to make materials that you can bond to an airframe, but can also support very high heats. And the problem with the traditional composite is you have to have multiple layers because metals expand different than ceramics. And so what I'm doing is I'm integrating a metal and a ceramic in this graded structure so that one side of the structure is almost entirely ceramic The other side is a metal that can be bonded to an airframe, and it gives us incredible thermal protection, and it seems to have good ballistic characteristics as well. So and again, it was being in the right place when I heard a conversation, and I said, you know what, we might have an answer for that. So whenever someone says, you know, we need something to actually engineer pores in a unique manner, my ears perk up, and I'm like, yeah, I've got it, I can do it. Now, of course, the problem is, with all these publications, other people are learning this. And so other people are getting interested in it. But it's interesting because the students that have helped me develop it, it seems simple, but it actually is a little bit of a challenge to make it work exactly. And I call ceramic processing as much of an art as it is a science. And so just imagine if I gave 5 of you in this room the recipes for a chocolate chip cookie, and I said, here you go. Would you get 5 identical chocolate chip cookies? Not a chance. Some would probably be flat, some burnt, some, I mean, you know, you can just imagine it's a little bit like cooking. And so there's little tweaks that go along the way that make it work. And if you don't follow that, it turns into a mess, and people are like, Sofie, this thing doesn't work at all. And inside I'm like, yes, that's exactly what I want. If I can keep that a little bit of a secret for a while, that's great. And so it is a challenge. Ceramic processing is a little bit of an art, and even students that I give recipes to and I say, follow this, the first 20 times they try it, they can't get a good looking structure. And then they learn what to look for. They learn what a slurry is supposed to look like. And then after that process is done, they've got to learn it. So there's this learning curve that's actually quite beneficial. Anything else? Yeah?
Have you tried it, or has there been any work done with like different anodes and cathodes? Because I know like lithium mining is kind of like nasty.
Yes, and certainly that is a problem. And when you think of lithium, because a lot of the world's supply comes from Bolivia, an unstable source, so we are also looking at sodium ion.
Oh, cool.
And sodium is everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And sodium ion batteries have a lot of characteristics similar to lithium, a little bit heavier, but sodium is extremely abundant, still reactive like lithium, and so we are looking at sodium ion batteries with these types of ceramic materials as well.
Cool.
Great question, huh? Awesome. Well, yeah, I think what's our time look like here? It's about 5 o'clock. We were almost there. So I don't know, unless you have anything else to say, thank you very much. I loved your questions. That was fantastic. I'm glad I gave a little more time for that. If there's something you want to ask and you didn't want to ask in front of everyone else, come up and talk to me. Other than that, have a great day. I'll let you dismiss them, but
Yeah, it turns out that for some reason check-in didn't work, so if you could give your names to Atticus and I as you exit the room, we can get you guys checked in online and still get you your TNC credit. So.
Yeah, but guys, let's give Dr. Sofie a big.
all right, have a great, keep warm. It's going to be a cold weekend.